My name is Christoph. I am an intern with Gus Fuller-Rackes' office, representing Fuller-Rackes. Last year, 2018, the World Health Organization attributed about 4 million deaths to indoor air pollution due to indoor combustion of organic materials. However, organic materials seem to, on Dr. Corsi's slides, be less absorbent, or at least by wood and apples, the few odd examples mentioned there seem to be less, let's say, detrimental to health than a lot of these plastics and whatnot, inorganic plastics. Is that generally a trend that organic materials, say the aromatics in cedar wood, are less harmful to our health, or am I just imagining that?
I can take that if you want. So in the World Health Organization, what they're talking about there is combustion of biomass fuels in homes. What Rich is talking about is material like activated carbon that just sits there and adsorbs materials. I don't know, products of combustion are often not very healthy to be breathing.
Yeah, I was going to add that. I think that when you look at the sort of spectrum of indoor pollution, if you don't properly vent while you're cooking, and I'll kick this back to Nina in a moment, combustion of natural gas creates pollutants we're exposed to that we know are harmful. Nitrogen dioxide, for example, in indoor environments, particulate matter that Nina mentioned. It's not to the same scale as cook stoves in Asia and that type of thing. But it's still, from our perspective, it's a really important source from a health standpoint, and the research actually bears that out. I don't know if, Nina, you want to add to that.
I think you guys covered it pretty well. So when we're talking about organic matter, there's so much there, and I think those are two very different things. So the organic matter that's present in our homes as a building material, unless there's a fire, that's not going to become a source of particles. But then the World Health Organization study was really talking about combustion of biomass. So using wood or coal or other kinds. Some people use dung, and they're burning those materials for cooking, and that leads to very, very high emissions of particulate matter.
Now, often not ventilated very well. And so especially women and children spend a lot of time indoors in a very smoky environment, breathing those products of combustion. Other questions? Yes.
Susanna Howard, studying chemistry Foster's office. I was really impressed with the 30 smoke research strategy, or roadmap. Is that something that was instigated by a federal scientific agency, or is that something that you all organically developed on your own?
No, actually, the study was... Yeah. This was a study that it was essentially carried out in California by 8 different research groups, all of them funded by the state. The state of California has an interesting funding mechanisms for tobacco-related, it's called Tobacco-Related Diseases Research Program, and it goes on one side covering the health side, but also the research like what we do in terms of chemistry and exposure. And that fund is that program is funded directly from the tax on tobacco products. I'm not aware of other states having a similar program like that. In our case, because we are a federal organization, the lab is Department of Energy laboratory. What we do is, in a way, we can carry out that research by leveraging the resources from the DOE and LBNL. For example, just to give you an example, some of the measurements I show here were done at a big facility we have that is called the Advanced Light Source. It's a synchrotron that where we do research both in-house, but also mostly we host researchers from around the world to do really cutting-edge studies. So that's one of an example in which our research is both benefiting from being in a federal organization and also the state resources.
Other questions? Yes.
Can you talk a little bit about...
Your name and...
Oh, yeah, I'm sorry. Seth Stokes from Senator Feinstein's office on the intern. Let's see. Yeah, so could you talk a little bit more about how some of these indoor pollutants affect like worker productivity, maybe like office buildings?
Sure. You want to take that? Okay. Productivity is is a field that has been studied for a long time, and we are learning more and more about. Let's say traditionally, I think productivity was defined in terms of or quantified in terms of, for example, typing mistakes or more mechanical effects. And in order to get to that, you need to have really poor air quality levels, which is often not the case in most cases. So what we are learning now through relatively newer studies is that much lower levels of pollution that we thought historically that were not a problem. I'm talking in this case about carbon dioxide. So levels of carbon dioxide in buildings that are at levels that we possibly could have in this room or in any classroom in where you have a large number of students. Some of these are new studies. It's research that has to really be confirmed and validated by more numerous studies. But what it's showing is that you start perceiving some effects in what is called cognitive performance, and that is measured indirectly through, for example, through a software system where people can be performing simulated tasks, and the software can quantify how those tasks are done and give you a number out of that. So you can even assess, for example, the focus or how you use information. These are really difficult things to measure. There is a recent study that was led by Harvard about a year ago in which something similar was done with pilots running airplane pilots running a simulator. And in that case, the evaluation was done by an FAA-trained person that would sort of rate and quantify the maneuvers and the number of mistakes that were done. And also in that case, there was an effect with the CO2 level in the range of values that we typically have in buildings. So that is, I think, growing evidence that there is an effect, there is something there. It's another example, I think, that we can mention here about how much we don't know yet about the effects of indoor air quality on not just our health, which of course is bad when you get to a health effect, but even if you don't get sick, you can even have important effect in terms of productivity measured in different ways. I think about students in a classroom. That is a situation where you really want students to be creative and engaged and paying attention, etc. So this is a really, really important problem to focus on.
Yeah. If I can add a little bit to that, just coming from the studies performed outdoors, large epidemiological studies that look at populations and their exposure to outdoor pollutants. We don't really have that huge body of knowledge for indoors, but there have been studies showing that concentrations of particulate matter as they go up, there are more subtle health effects, like what Hugo was saying, related to the aging of your brain, stress levels, anxiety, and things like that, that maybe 10, 20 years ago we wouldn't even think about. We would think about mortality rates, right? But now we're getting to the point where we can discern these more subtle health effects related to really quality of life, and we are finding a link between air pollution exposure and quality of life.
Another question over here.
So I'm Sean with AAAS. On a personal level, are there things that you, as scientists who do this kind of research, would you say I don't like having in my home that you would want to offer as someone who has 2 young children?
And so I'm going to repeat the question so we get it in the recording, but the question is, on a personal level, are there things that you would prefer not to have in your home, especially if you had young children?
So the last part of that question is a really important part. When you reach a certain age, I get asked this a lot when I give presentations. When you get to my age, I don't worry about being exposed to a lot of things anymore. That's one of the benefits of getting older.
You're not that old.
But I am concerned about young couples that are thinking about starting a family or that are pregnant or have young children in the home. I think that's the most important part of life, and that's where we don't want to have a fetus or children exposed to things like endocrine disrupting chemicals, various flame retardants, plasticizers, et cetera. I think the other issue is cooking again, and I know at least in Texas, where I used to live until a year ago, a lot of homes were constructed without exhaust vents on stove hoods. So they were just basically recirculating grease traps that basically just blew all the gases from your gas stove and particles, et cetera, back in your face. So it's not just what you're exposed to, it's how you're exposed. And so I would be concerned about a house that doesn't have an exhaust vent over a stove in the house. But I think where you are in life is important, and the last part of that question was really critical, is if you have children in the house. Don't burn scented candles. That's another thing I would say. So scented candles particularly generate a lot of fine particulate matter and can have polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons in them. I go into a lot of young people's homes that do have children, and you see scented candles all over the place, right? So that's another source I would tell people not to use.
I've stopped using Teflon-coated pans. I've gone back to the cast iron and the plain metal pans. And we take our shoes off when we come indoors, so we're not tracking in old paint dust from, in the dirt around our house. Others?
God, where to begin? So I'm actually expecting a baby. I'm 6 months pregnant, so I've been thinking about that a lot. There is a lot that you can do, but there's a lot that you really can't avoid. For example, my office building was painted not 3 weeks ago, like the first week of classes. We're back on campus, and then they decide to paint my hallway, and I was pretty upset because I had meetings and I couldn't just skip work and go home, right? Even though I understand that SVOCs are emitted during painting, and I should be limiting my exposure. Another thing that I did is, we have a room for the baby in the house. We did not paint that room because I see a lot of ads, and I see a lot of, pregnant women painting the baby's room. Everybody wants the nursery with the decorations, and that was something I was adamant against. So I try to limit exposures, and I will reinforce the point that Rich made about combustion in general. We know a lot of research, as mentioned before, about exposure in developing countries where we're using these really inefficient combustion heat sources for cooking. Well, we're in a developed country. I'm sure maybe some of us will use a wood-burning stove at home, but that's really rare. Usually what we have is natural gas burning, and then there are the things you do by choice, which is the burning of candles of any kind, burning of incense and things like that, burning of sage because whatever reason. I try to avoid any kind of combustion source, especially the optional ones in my home, because I know they emit particulate matter of different sizes, and that has a detrimental health effect.
Question?
Can I just one brief, very briefly on third-hand smoke? Clearly, children and small children is a particular concern because clearly the contact with carpet, the contact with surfaces in general, children, especially in the first few months, don't leave the house very much, so the exposure is also a function of how much time they are there. There is also the issue of mouthing objects, everything goes to the mouth. So it's not just dermal uptake of contaminants, it's also ingestion, which is particularly important for children. That is true for smoke, it's also true for all the other semi-volatile chemicals.
Question in the back.
Ken Film with the Congressional GIS caucus. You focus a lot on people chemistry and how people impact indoors. When you add pets to the equation, what measurements or what science is occurring there? Because we have pets as companions, support animals, rescue animals. So there's an interaction or measurement between pets and people.
So the question is about pets indoors and what they bring.
The microphone just got passed to me because I guess I'm the dog person here.
Yes.
Big dog lover. So issues with pets, right? Pets, if they're indoor-outdoor pets, and if there's pesticides outside, they're going to track in pesticides on their paws and on their fur. They're going to roll on the grass and bring pesticides in that way. If you have an indoor-outdoor pet, it's best to minimize the use of pesticides in the yard that the pet's in. That's been documented. if it's a dog, the dander is not as bad as if it's a cat in general from an allergic standpoint, but still there's dust associated with the dander, and that dust, as I said, can accumulate other things and be resuspended. I'm a dog person, and I'm old enough that I don't worry about all those things again. So, but that's my comment on indoor-outdoor pets.
But I'm a cat person,
Yeah, okay.
just for the record. Other questions? Yes.
Hi, Mel Peppers with House Energy and Commerce. I'm not surprised when I see the slides of funding, that's like a hodgepodge. And I was a little surprised with one, especially the tobacco, that there's only 2 federal agencies, HUD and NIH. Can you talk a little bit about what policymakers can be doing and federal agencies to support the science, and then vice versa, how science can inform policy? And thank you for the shout out of supporting epidemiology that's taken a bit of a hit for different reasons. But if you could comment on that, what advice do you have for policymakers?
So the question is about what advice we have for policy. And I'm going to turn it over to these guys, but I did want to say that there's a lot left to learn about outdoor chemistry, but there's been a lot more research in outdoor air, and it's probably that there's a regulatory authority that is responsible for outdoor air, that keeping outdoor air healthy, that's the EPA, and there is no for residences, for homes, there is no regulatory authority. But there are several federal agencies that do research on indoor air and who make policy decisions that impact indoor air. And some of them are probably in the room today, or they will be tomorrow. So let me turn it over.
Thank you. With respect to tobacco in particular, there is an important framework that is now mostly covered by the FDA, and the research done in association with the NIH addressing tobacco products. And that is, if you want, the impact of the tobacco products, and especially the new tobacco products, on users. So what we are describing here is what happens after the products are used in the environment. And as far as I understand, the FDA does not cover that. So that's not their mission. That's not what's on the 2009 Tobacco and Family, I forgot the name of the bill, the 2009 bill that gave FDA authority over tobacco products. The agencies I mentioned, this is very recent development. So it's HUD, I think, was maybe 3-4 years ago, and NIH even more recent. I think it's NIHS, the institute in particular, that is started. This is just 2 cases that I know, because the PI, Professor Matt, is in our consortium, that we were really happy to see that for the first time we are starting to break into this. But clearly you can find in other agencies very relevant questions that could be addressed in terms of third-hand smoke, but I think broadly speaking about indoor pollutants. And that is one of the reasons I think we're having all these conversations is precisely to understand what are the various problems that could be addressed and how. So thanks for the question.
I think that the topic kind of falls in between several agencies. So
Right, I was just going to make that point. Indoor air quality, certainly indoor chemistry, spans a lot of different things, right? And my experience has been oftentimes NIH and NSF may have specific things they want to work on. They're not talking to one another, right? So I'll go to NSF and say, I'm interested in indoor air quality, and they'll say, that's a health issue, go talk to NIH. And you go to NIH and they say, you're an engineer, go back and talk to NSF. And I think they're, bridging agencies that have different interests but around the same subject is something that's needed, whether it be HUD, NSF, NIH, EPA, GSA, DOE, would be a very welcome policy change than the sort of siloed approach that's been used in the past, where we all try to find the right place to figure out where we can get funding for our specific interests, when really it's the field is really an integrated field. What we do on the energy side affects what happens on the chemistry side, affects what happens on the health side.
what happened to Rich has happened to me too. So I just wanted to stress that a little bit more. It's particularly interesting to be in the field of exposure science, so trying to understand what people are exposed to, because for NIH, well, I'm not investigating the health effects, I'm just saying what's coming into our bodies. So for them, it's not of interest. But then if you go to NSF, they'll say, no, that's NIH. So I wanted to agree with that.
Can I follow up with one thing that Nina said a little while ago, and that was related to her exposure to paint at work. This is something that bugs the heck out of me. So latex paints used to have a small group of all organic compounds in them that by every account, every toxicological study caused no health problems at all, right? But they were all organic compounds, and people wanted no VOC or low VOC paints, primarily because of concerns regarding those VOCs getting outdoors and producing ozone, right? So the concern was that. But they were of no concern from a health standpoint indoors. In response to that concern, we've now replaced those benign vol organic compounds in paint with semi-vol organic compounds, some of which we know are endocrine disrupting chemicals. So in response to trying to generate low VOC paints or no VOC paints to protect the outdoor atmosphere, we've just made buildings a lot worse, especially for people like Nina, who's expecting a child. And that's, I think, based upon a lack of science, a lack of knowledge, and I think it's really reflective of the fact that this field just needs a lot more research and a lot more public education and policy, education of policymakers. It was just a bad decision, and it drives me nuts every time I hear the word paint.
So for the last point, I'd like to bring Annette up.
And we're organizing the symposium tomorrow. We have 3 of the speakers, well, 4 of the speakers, because Barb's also speaking. All are speaking tomorrow. But we also have some speakers on some different topics as well. Alan Goldstein will be speaking about a comparison between indoor and outdoor air. We're going to have people speaking about long-range transportation of these indoor pollution particles all the way to the Arctic. We're going to be having somebody who is going to be speaking about cook stoves, about human emissions and how that interacts. But also an interesting topic is going to be about how indoor air pollution affects outdoor pollution. So if you want to learn more, you can join us tomorrow either at our headquarters, or we also are doing a webcast. And you can come up to me for more information. And there's also the brochure for the symposium is outside on the table. Hopefully there's still some outside. But I definitely want to thank all of our speakers for flying here, coming here to present today and discuss today. And if you have any questions afterwards, we'll still be around for a few minutes. And I think that's it. Anything else, Sean? Okay, great. And thanks to Sean Gallagher at AAAS for helping organize this here. Thank you.